All right, so we're going to get started. So welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or maybe good evening, depending on where you're from. Welcome to what I believe is the 8th installment of NextBillion.ai's Spatial Insider web series. I'm Tara Kordiak. I head up sales and BD on behalf of NextBillion for the Americas. I'm here in Washington, D.C. Really excited to have two really great guests joining us today, but just a high level to give you some insight on what we'll be chatting about today, and then I'll let our two guests introduce themselves. So we're talking about mobility today. Mobility, I think, in this world has quite a few definitions depending on your perspective. We're going to talk a little bit about kind of the macro global trends that are influencing mobility around the world. And then we'll dig in a little bit to the impact on emerging markets and also talk a bit about data as well. So I have two really great guests with me today. The first is Devin DeVries from Where's My Transport. He's joining us today from South Africa, but normally based in the UK. And we've had a little bit of a change in our guest from Geospatial World, but she'll be wonderful. I have no doubt. Sarah Hisham, she's in, it'll be all good. She's joining us from Malaysia. Geospatial World, for those of you who have been in this space for a while, I think know it well and love it as well. So welcome, really appreciate your time. I know our time is very valuable these days. So I appreciate you giving us and sharing your knowledge and expertise, excuse me. So with that, I'm gonna hand it over to both of you for a little bit of an introduction. Want to hear kind of what brought you here today, maybe a bit about background on your various organizations. That would be great. So why don't we kick off with Devin? We'd love to hear from you, your story.
Sure, thanks, Tara. Great to be here with you and Sarah. Yes, I'm Devin. I am founder and CEO of Where's My Transport. This is my third startup in a journey that has largely been focused and centered on mobility. And in my role at Where's My Transport, I'm principally focused on global partnerships, fundraising, business development. So I guess a lot of things that you do as well, Tara, there's likely a lot of crossover there. And yeah, in terms of Where's My Transport's role in the world, Where's My Transport is a mobility technology company that is a trusted provider of mobility and mobility-related data, specifically in emerging markets globally. So yeah, that's just a teeny bit on the background. I'll leave the rest for the discussion.
Yeah, great, awesome. Yeah, thanks for that intro, Devin. Be excited to hear your perspective for sure. All right, Sarah, let's hand it over to you for the same story. Well, not the same story, a bit different, but your version.
Thank you, Tara. Hi, Devin. So hello, everyone. Greetings from Kuala Lumpur. My name is Sarah Hisham, Director at Geospatial World. First and foremost, apologies from Mr. Sanjay Kumar. Many of you must have expected to listen to him today. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it. I cannot feel his shoes, but I'm happy to be here and to contribute to the conversation. For those who are not familiar with Geospatial World, we are a geospatial consulting company based out of Noida in India. We produce a geospatial industry report. We do market research. We have our own media platforms, the Geospatial World magazine and an online portal. We also organize geospatial conferences globally. And as for myself, I've been with the organization for over 14 years now. It's actually only my second job. I work for the events and the media divisions for Asia Pacific region based in Malaysia. I also lead the location intelligence unit in the company. So actually for Geospatial World, our domain is more in the traditional geospatial market, the survey and mapping, the observation, but we realized that location intelligence is the up and coming domain in the larger geospatial ecosystem, and we want to be part of that. So thank you to NextBillion for the opportunity, and I look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, awesome. I'm glad you can make it. And I come from kind of the origins of true mapping, kind of pulling us through to where we are today, that there's the applicability doesn't go away. In fact, it's growing. So yeah, I appreciate that. And 14 years, that must mean Sanjay's a good boss. So that's awesome. All right. So why don't we dive in? So I think, we all know that there are quite a few key things that influence the dynamics of mobility today. And obviously over the past couple of years, dealing with COVID, we're going into year 3. We're learning to live with it now. Mobility has really changed as companies and organizations have had to pivot to figure out how to engage with their customers and think about, delivering goods and services and making the important things for survival available. And I think especially emerging markets, it was really key. So I know we're talking about emerging markets today, but I'm curious as to your take on maybe what some of the macro developments, from a global perspective around urban development and how that will influence mobility. And I've been thinking about the reverse, especially emerging markets where mobility and the need for that and the need for hyperlocal mobility might start to influence urban development. Are we starting to build around new mobility opportunities? So I would love to hear both your takes on maybe both sides of the coin there, if we don't mind. And maybe we'll start with Sarah on that one.
Thanks, Tara. I think the major key trends that we see after COVID is definitely the shared economy, the on-demand economy. Like people are now going totally digital with their mobility. And it's not just about movement of people, it's actually the movement of goods have also changed, totally changed. And I think the hyperlocal trends are actually making these, ride hailing, food delivery, groceries delivery, and even courier services, they are becoming actually hyperlocal. Transaction, there is a term, quick commerce, like transactions are happening within hours instead of days. Like you order something and you get it within hours. So I think this is definitely a key trend. And because I come from geospatial side, I think this is a big trend for our geospatial industry, because these kind of services, they need precise mapping infrastructure. Yeah. Right. And secondly, I would say the trends in autonomous, it's not just the cars or the public transportation, but also now these days we have seen robot food delivery or drones package delivery, and this can only happen in hyperlocal market. And this too, I think, is actually shaping the global mobility. And the third one I would say is the micro mobility, the e-bikes, the e-scooters. I think these kind of trends are creating new dynamics in urban mobility. And the service providers, they actually need a lot of mapping infrastructure, a lot of positioning infrastructure, because they need to know the exact position of their assets throughout the city. And they need to make sure that those e-bikes, e-scooters are parked at the right designated parking, etc. So I think these 3 trends are really shaping the urban mobility ecosystem. And maybe Devin can comment on the urban development ecosystem, because I'm not very familiar with that. So sure. Devin, up to you.
Yeah, thank you. And you just real quick, you talked about, how the adding more services, moving goods to people, and, that hyperlocal. And one of the trends that I'm seeing is like getting goods and services closer to people so we can actually deliver, no pun intended, on that, same day, within hours delivery, which also helps with sustainability and all of those things. So yeah, moving goods and services within that area, I think is something important that I've seen and heard a lot of discussion about. So yeah, I think that makes sense. So yeah, Devin, love to hear your take and perspective on this conversation.
I agree with everything Sarah shared. I mean, those three would definitely be in my top five as well. I think as you rightfully said at the beginning of the call, Tara, there's also mobility as a multivariant term in terms of it means different things to different folk. But I think there's a key transition or evolution within the mobility ecosystem that's taking place, and that's not just between sort of public mobility, shared mobility, and micromobility, but also this point around the movement of people and goods and sort of a convergence on multiple use cases of the same fleets of vehicles. So fleets start to be purposed in different ways at different times of day, so that perhaps you reduce positioning kilometers, as they call it in the transit segment of mobility, and you start to actually use those dead or positioning kilometers for efficient, productive use cases. So I think therein is a sort of a multi-directional convergence that is taking place. And I think that leads maybe to one of the other trends that we're seeing, and this obviously plays very closely into where NextBillion also operates, but this data-driven strategies for fleet optimization of many different kinds. I think data sits at the heart of decision making, and increasingly we're learning how to leverage it, as opposed to just like, oh wow, we've got all of this data, but we don't really know how to crunch it to produce real world outcomes and benefits that are lasting and sustainable. And I think, Sarah, you already touched on this, but the impact of electrification with e-bikes, but I think just broadly, and to your point, Tara, on how is the reverse true between sort of infrastructure, mobility infrastructure, the impact of electrification on infrastructure and how it is guiding investments into infrastructure is something that is obviously occurring en masse within the developed markets, and data is being used to sort of focus that you can't electrify everything all at once. You have to sort of pick your corridors and where the best places to inject that capital. But when I look towards emerging markets, where I know Sarah and I are both much more focused, and NextBillion, I believe, touches all markets, but these are the homes where high growth opportunities, I think, are going to be much more prevalent over the coming decades. And even where this post-pandemic era has obviously created greater slowdown within the emerging market than the developed market, that's already been documented. There are also still studies that are coming out that have shown even with that reality, the overall growth we're expecting in the coming decade within emerging markets is still going to outstrip that of the developed market environment. So I'm still looking forward to seeing what the overall trends are that we're seeing emerging within these emerging markets, how they will also transform and hopefully propel these markets forward in alignment with some of those mega trends that we touched on.
Yeah, that makes sense. And thinking about, talking about the developed regions, it feels like to me a lot more difficult to kind of insert the infrastructure, navigate policies and procedures that have been creating technology and thinking about helping move these emerging markets into a more sustainable mobility market. And, how do you think that will help us understand and then subsequently, support those advancements in these markets? So we could talk about data all day long. I know that. So maybe just, a high level of how important and where you think data is going to play a key role. Devin, why don't we go with you?
I'm very aware of the lag, so I'll wait to be called out before.
No worries. No worries.
I feel like when we started out at Where Is My Transport to sort of use the journey of our business and where data has played a pivotal role in all of that. As the name of the door would suggest, we simply wanted to make people's daily lives better and their experiences on public transportation better. At the end of the day, typically about 2/3 of people within an emerging market city are reliant on public transportation for freedom of movement, and that means getting to work, getting to school, getting to family, getting to church, getting to sport, whatever your interactions and role is within society, you are reliant on public transportation in order for that to be possible for you in your daily life. Albeit that, you know, we wanted to go after building a consumer solution first and foremost, the challenges we faced actually were all centered and rooted in data. We first had to, you know, tackle challenges of how do you bring formal and informal transportation together so that you can route plan and journey plan across these modalities, and that was one challenge. But the real challenge to scale that we faced as a business was access to reliable information market on market. And so, you know, my origins are, I started out in South Africa. The business is now based out of the UK. But the journey that we've gone on as a business and a team has really been about solving this dearth of data challenge. And that has largely been centered on this area of transport. But when you think about big business and how big business is now thinking about growth, big business understands that the largest of the growth opportunities, the lowest saturation, the sort of future economy of new internet users, that all resides within these emerging market environments. However, no matter how many hundreds of millions of billions you spent on your product and service stack, unless it has good information to work with, you can't really meet people where they are and allow that product or service to actually provide utility to the individual. Right. So I realize that maybe taking a bit of a roundabout route here, but it you know, for myself and the team, that has only underscored just how much of a challenge reliable location, transit, and geospatial data is within these markets. And I know for all three of the brands represented on this call, this solving for this challenge within these markets, whether you're trying to solve for the map and how frequently the map is updated, or you're trying to solve for points of interest data, and not just representing the formal economy, which speaks to the 15 to 20% that are more financially included and have access to credit card services. But I love how one of my team members referred to these points of interest. He refers to not the points of interest that are facing the street, but the points of interest that have their back to the street. That is actually the mass majority of commerce, yet it remains absent from all of the products and services that are, you know, native on our devices. So going after this challenge and solving for this challenge has become something that has been actually at the heart of the work that we're doing, which is why at the beginning I sort of spoke to solving for mobility and mobility related data, because what we've also come to understand when I speak about that 2/3 of the population is because of the way that people move, it has shaped how they interact with society. And so most of the services that they use, the products that they procure, those things all actually centered around the transportation corridors, with the clustering actually around the transportation hubs. And so in the work that we've been doing, trying to elevate access and just knowledge of this information now existing, both in the transit centers for formal and informal, but also starting to look towards what we call the informal economy of POIs, the undigitized, the invisible. Mm-hmm. This has been something that's been at the heart of the work that we've been doing over the last several years in the 50 cities plus around the world that we've been doing this. So I realize a bit of a roundabout answer to your question, Tara, but the role of location data, it is absolutely critical and central, whether you are a very big multinational trying to provide a relevant product or service in the market, or you're a local provider of services that is already in that market and you're just trying to be relevant to the broader base of the population. You have to be able to represent this undigitized information.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't actually agree. I think that was a very clear directional answer for sure. And it's interesting. It links back to what Sarah was just talking about in terms of that local knowledge, that institutional knowledge that these hyper local economies have, and the folks moving around those economies, those of the businesses that have their backs to the street, they know that they have their backs to the street. So why not take that information from them and incorporate that into the overall picture in terms of data? So again, that focus, hyper local focus, I think is what's going to fuel those changes that you're seeing. So Sarah, I think that connection that I just pointed out, hopefully, I think maybe we'll also give, I'd love to hear your, your perspective on what we just talked about in terms of the geospatial and location data really supporting these advancements.
Definitely. Just adding on to what Devin was saying, actually, we are seeing the map requirement, the data requirement has gone to the next level. Like they're no longer just needing maps with the building names, street names. They need dynamic maps. Like they need to know whether the street is one way or two way, whether it's allowed to park at the sideways, or which one is the entry point, which one is the exit point. So they need all this information now. Everything has to be dynamic. Everything has to be real time. And when we are driving, we would like to know the real-time traffic condition, whether there is an accident, whether there is the road work, maintenance, whatever is happening in what location. So the data requirement has gone further, to the next level. So it's not just about maps, it's about real-time updates as well. So this is what we are seeing, the trends, especially in the emerging market where the maps are not as updated. So this is where I think the opportunities are for not only for the mapping companies. One trend that I'm seeing right now is that technology companies are actually producing maps. If I take, for example, in Southeast Asia, our equivalent to Uber is called Grab. So this company, they provide ride-hailing, food deliveries, even courier services, groceries deliveries, everything. They produce their own maps. They develop their own map in-house. And very, very recently, I think 2 or 3 months back, they announced that they are now providing their maps as an enterprise service. So this is a big development for our industry, that these technology companies, something like Google Maps, because everybody relies on them. They are not mapping companies, but they are technology companies producing maps. So I think this too is a trend that we need to look out for, on top of being an opportunity for geospatial companies, for data companies to provide their services. I think this is where geospatial or location services will be big, when all these technology companies start entering into the market. That's how the technology will become mainstream.
Yeah, and I agree. And obviously, our founders came from Grab, and we have a similar viewpoint in that custom map data is absolutely key to enabling the quick kind of reaction to what's changing in the world, and the idea of real-time geospatial content as one of those enablers is really important. And we just, all of us just touched on that. So it's one thing to map and have that as kind of a planning, get that viewpoint, and then integrating the real-time information or that local hyperlocal knowledge into that is really important. I actually have a question that I think might kind of tie into this, is how location data and technology will help these markets around sustainability, traffic congestion. Obviously, this is a topic of conversation around the world with climate change and how we're all thinking about that. So I think that maybe that's a good segue to start to kind of wrap up our conversation, and then maybe share some advice as we're getting close to wrapping, and have a couple more questions that I'd like to dig into from the chat. But yeah, sustainability. Let's not ignore that. So any thoughts on, how this data, how the thought process of creating these mobility opportunities will help us start to address some of those challenges? It's a big one. It's a big question.
So, I mean, I'm happy to kick us off on this one. The challenges around sustainability, again, are the SDGs do a great job of sort of showing the different vectors in which we can affect or improve sustainability at large for us as people on this planet. But, SDG 11.2 specifically speaks to urban mobility. And one of the things that is evident within emerging markets is these markets naturally have lagged in many respects, but in order for them to be investable in the long-term sense, especially larger scale investments that affect infrastructure towards more sustainable transportation networks, better accessibility for all areas around the city, information and data is absolutely critical in order to unlock the investment. So this is something that we have seen market, and actually the work that we do has unlocked infrastructural investments in all of the continental regions or emerging market continental regions to date. And so we're very familiar with how important this data is to unlocking capital to flow into these markets. But I also actually wanted to connect back, and it is sort of an adjacency to sustainability, but what Sarah referred to a few moments ago with the dynamic nature of these markets. I think what is sometimes missed is that there are basic services that are available to people today within a developed market setting, whether it's the time of the next bus or train, or being able to get complete options from A to B, actually having all the options show up on your phone, not just 10 or 20% of the options. And that can have a significant impact, not just on the quality of service to people, but how you can start to shape society's decision-making at large, because we have no doubt that large providers of apps and mobility services are affecting how people move. But for the same to be said within an emerging market environment, there's actually an even higher bar that needs to be crossed or surpassed, which is that these markets are far more, I'm not going to use the volatile as a negative connotation, dynamic. These markets are far more dynamic in their nature. And so actually the role that real-time information plays within allowing products and services to tell the truth, to seem streetwise, to seem to represent ground truth, is actually a higher barrier or a sort of higher hurdle that you have to try and get over in order to provide quality, reliable, trustworthy products and services into these markets. So the challenges that big business and small business face in trying to provide reliable information within these markets is not just pivotal to providing these widespread services to people and citizens, but also towards moving these markets towards being more sustainable. So I share your feelings around like how pivotal real-time and dynamic information is, and how we really need creative solutions, especially in markets where there is perhaps an absence of infrastructure emitting this information. So we have to find new ways of getting to reliable answers and insights.
Yeah, and I think we talked about human behavior. Sarah brought that up, and with the concept of sustainability and for humans to try to make impactful decisions around their choice of mobility. You just mentioned, Devin, I think a key thing is that reliable, trustworthy infrastructure and transportation is, if that's not available, people aren't going to change their habits. We're so reliant on our own personal ways to get around, because oftentimes we don't have trust in those systems. So it's a little chicken and egg, right? If we're expecting or hoping people will make better choices, we have to provide those choices to them in that reliable way. So, and obviously data plays a key role in that, and the dynamic data a really key role. So I think that's that it's interesting kind of take on it. Sarah, sustainability for mapping really started out trying to understand the world and figure out how different ecosystems are working together, and the kind of philanthropic side of the geospatial world is very well known. Now it's more urgent, right? And we're thinking about it in different ways.
Right.
What are your thoughts on how, our approach to mobility, the leveraging data will help us think about and actually implement some strategies to help with sustainability and traffic congestion and the things that kind of get us to the point of negative impact, right?
I think businesses will need to play a big role in sustainability. They need to adopt the right technology. And when we talk about location data, real-time location-based services, so it's, for example, logistics companies, they can use location data to actually manage their fleet and to understand their drivers' behavior. And then they can actually plan a route that is optimized, and that way they save fuel and there won't be too much carbon in the environment. So this kind of, I think, sustainable practices, we have to push through the businesses, the big corporations, how they are actually managing their workflows, how they are managing their operation. I think that can contribute a lot to sustainability. Manufacturing, even those, public transportation. So they have to actually create operation framework that actually serves the environment as well. So, but of course, they need to understand the human behavior and everything. But I think individually it will be difficult. But from businesses, big corporations' point of view, I think we have to push them to use this technology to improve their operation, sustainability, and everything. So
yeah, you're speaking our language over here at NextBillion.ai, because those are the things we're thinking about, helping fleets get the most accurate routes, knowing where the exact location to drop off, reducing idling time. Those are all things that we know will, over time, and if more and more fleets are doing that, hopefully that will have that positive impact. So thinking about public transportation, we had another question, and I was actually going to kind of bring that up. Obviously, we know that in certain locations, public transit is very well entrenched, not always necessarily managed in the best way, or operating in the best way, or thinking about sustainability, but inserting mobility opportunities into an existing public transit infrastructure is ideal. And Devin, I think you talked about kind of the multimodal approach, connecting all those dots, also leveraging all of those assets to not only move people, but to move packages and other things. We're taking advantage of what's already out there, but there's challenges there too. And thinking about the role of public transit combined with the role of mobility, how do you see those coming together? And what are, well, I think there's a lot of challenges there, but the opportunity too. Can you touch on that a little bit and thinking about public transit in particular?
Oh, that is wide.
I know it's a big one.
But I think just in short, the future, I believe, in mobility is a combination of public transit meets shared mobility. It is, I can't say where on that scale, the split leg. I think in markets that are more affluent, you will have more on the side of shared mobility than you would in a developed market environment. I would always hope that the transit side would be bigger because it is better for the climate, it is better for cities, it is better for the community at large. So yeah, I realize that's not necessarily addressing the whole question, but when I think about the future and where we're moving, and I look at companies like Uber or Grab or Gojek or Didi and others, yes, there is this convergence of people and parcels, but actually, how do we start to bring together all of the modalities that people use between A and B to allow shared mobility and public transit to coexist in all markets? We're starting to get there in developed markets, but if we could get there faster within the emerging markets, I think the people at large, the communities who are reliant on these services really are the ones that stand to gain. And ultimately, that should also improve the bottom line of these companies as well as they draw more users into their product ecosystems.
Yeah. Definitely. I actually met, I think we participated in an event called Home Delivery World. And it's interesting that the profile of companies that attend, obviously there's the retail and where they need to deliver things. But then I've seen a lot of government transportation representative and other like Greyhound. Last year, I met somebody from Greyhound who was starting to think about how to leverage their buses and adding to their fleet to move things across country in a different way. So leveraging already an existing infrastructure and kind of taking advantage of the requirements of consumers and businesses out there. I thought that was a really interesting conversation, just starting, kind of scratching the surface, but I think the convergence of those two worlds are starting to come together a little bit more. So hopefully, we'll start to see that take more, take more of effect. Sarah, any thoughts on that public transit, mobility, cross-pollination, if you will?
Yes, similar to Devin, I think the key is partnership because this involves multi-stakeholders. In Singapore, I have seen this model where consumers can actually collect their parcel at train stations. There is like a locker at the train station. So this kind of partnership, I think, is very sustainable because it doesn't involve further, cars on the road or further fleets on the road. It's just customer walking to the train station and getting their stuff. And that's about it. I think is in emerging market, to be very frank, it will be challenging and it will be time consuming, but B2B partnership, I think, could be successful in terms of, logistic companies, the third-party companies, what do you call it, 3PL, the third-party logistics companies and train operators. And this kind of partnership, I think, might work in emerging markets.
Yeah. And the B2G. Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry, it's just a little ad there, completely sort of left of field, but perhaps interesting for the audience. What you were speaking about now with using the space on the Greyhound, Sarah, you're also connecting in with that. Like it's funny to me when as you said that, I was like, oh, I thought we were doing that already. Because if you think about it, we've been doing that with airlines for I know many decades, right? Like airlines, there's a whole aspect of every commercial flight that also has cargo that's slotting in there. And perhaps for the Greyhound type bus provider, this is newer within a developed market environment, but actually in emerging markets, the use of the transit cabin and actually the roof of the transit vehicles for the intercity vehicles, that has been used for as far back as I can remember when I took some of my first intercity trips on these informal minivans, which are like anything from 6 to 12-hour journeys. It was very common for us to be picking up parcels, unlike with the airlines, which is company to company logistics. This is person to person. And these parcels were being loaded up, and it could be anything from goats and chickens to, 1 square meter cubed bags of coconuts. But this space would be used, but there was no digital interface for how people could move these goods. It was very much like, hey, I put it on the bus with my friend Peter, look out for that bus coming by. But I've actually recently come across 1 or 2 startups. The one that comes to mind is called Yabante Express, and they're starting to digitize this age-old transport network that allows people to use these trips that are already taking place. You say, cool, we're going to add our goods to the vehicle and allow it to get place to place. And what they're actually starting to do is enable these change trips, so that now parcels are taking multiple transit rides to get across, say, 3 borders, as a new form of logistic network, although it's actually an age-old one that's just getting digitized. So anyways, it's just some extra knowledge that, some stuff I came across quite recently, and it surprised me, but at the same time, it's really great to see this kind of thing happening.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. And yeah, it's kind of that discovery of like, oh, why wasn't this already happening? Right. And that's really cool. So we have another question, just like pivot a little bit into maybe some specifics, and then I'd like to kind of wrap on your, an advice side. We always end with some advice, but I think, Devin, this is right in your wheelhouse, thinking about how important is very accurate, address information, important to this problem, even on a public transit side. So this is a question that came up. It would be really interesting to hear from your perspective that how important that is, the challenge, and then where are we, from your view in that world? Are we getting better? Is, the influence of crowdsource and, Sarah, you touched on the ability to take in kind of hyperlocal information. It would be great to hear from your perspective, Devin, to start, what you've discovered is how important that is to making this all work.
Sure. I think at large, address information is valuable, but that is different from important. So when I think about how people move from A to B, actually having complete addressing is not necessarily the most important thing. The most important thing is being able to find the place you're trying to go to. And so that doesn't necessarily require addressing. It requires a point of reference. And I know in particular for Sarah, this is, if you're grown, up in Malaysia, then I'm sure your lived experience is no different to mine, where from the perspective of people using colloquial names and landmarks and points of reference for both orientation and navigation, as things that you can then put into a product or a service in order to allow it to take you where you want to go. So, to the question of the viewer, I do think that we are making progress on that front. But is accurate address information necessary to be all and end all for public transit? I don't think so. Is it really important for good logistics and delivery? Absolutely. And I also wonder about, is the standard addressing or some of these alternate approaches to addressing actually going to take root in markets where addressing is not already the sort of the type of addressing we're most familiar with is not already completely embedded into society and ubiquitous? Then I'm interested to see how some of these other solutions might adapt what becomes the default standard for logistics. But at least from the transit perspective, we have focused a lot more on capturing what people use colloquially as points of reference, as landmarks, so that they can find where they're going to, as opposed to everything in between.
Yeah, it's almost like changing the definition of what an address is. And it's a dynamic definition, right? And I think that's a really interesting perspective, and the ability to create custom points of interest, and that could look different for everybody, right? Like my viewpoint of my world could be very different than yours. And I use this example of I may go get my cup of coffee at a coffee place that definitely has an address, but then I take that cup of coffee and go sit by my favorite fountain, in Central Park. That might be my view of an address now. And if I want to have somebody come meet me, that's my kind of custom location, right? So that, I think that definition of addressing is very unique. And Sarah, I think you've talked about this quite a bit, but any kind of closing thought on that question, and then we'll roll into the advice column section of our of our conversation.
Right. I agree with Devin. For public transit, it might not be as important, but for hyperlocal deliveries, because of time factor, because of service factor, I think accurate address is very important. But also, if we look at countries like India, where they are just it's just not possible to explain an address. Like I was in India for 2 months, and if I don't have Uber or anything, it would be very difficult for me to take taxi, because I have to explain to him where it is and everything. So I think at certain extent, an accurate address is required for taxi purpose, not like for buses or trains. That is very different, but otherwise it's not very important.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I think we just have a couple minutes left. So this is a great opportunity for, again, Ask Devin and Ask Sarah column. So Sarah, since you were the last one speaking, if you had to give a piece of advice to anybody working in the mobility space, maybe on the government side as well as on the business technology side, what would that one piece of advice be? And I know that's also a very hard question.
Well, I would say firstly, for businesses in mobility, ecosystem, it's very important that to understand first the importance of data, to understand what kind of data can help your business workflow, and then develop that capacity to use that data. And most of the time the data is there, but businesses, they don't understand how to leverage them, how this data, actually there are different layers of geospatial data, and every layer has different purposes for different workflows. Yeah. So this kind of understanding, I think, should be the first priority, to understand what is my business priority, what is it that I would like to achieve, what is the challenge that I would like to solve, and which data can do that for me. I think that is very important. And secondly, I mentioned to develop that capacity.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah,
good advice. Okay, Devin, over to you for your one piece of advice, or maybe two. We do two.
I guess from my perspective, maybe I'll leave something for founders if there are any founders on the line. But perhaps starting with your question first in terms of that target audience for businesses and government, I think reminding people that developed market solutions don't necessarily work within emerging markets. And that's a very broad statement. And yes, that is not absolute by any means, but genuinely being considered about that hyperlocal context, how the mobility ecosystems operate differently, how the question of the individual on the ground in a city that is much more dynamic than one that is much more predictable. How do all of those realities culminate in that human being whom you're trying to reach and serve? How does that culminate in them having a very different experience and a different set of questions in their mind when they use your product or service? And so I think that's something really important for businesses and governments to keep in mind as they try and roll things out. And then perhaps for the founders, if you're a founder that is brave or foolish enough to want to wander into the space of mobility and vocation, I think it's really helpful to keep in mind, in particular for mobility, that it's a really complex intersection of multiple misaligned stakeholders with disparate incentives and interests between the state and the private companies, the informal operators, the subsidized operators, and then the public at large. And so, you know, as a startup, just be really clear on who you're looking to serve. Otherwise, it could be you could really get lost in the process of trying to solve something that is much bigger than you and will take many, many companies and many years or decades to solve for. And so really be specific about who it is you're trying to serve and exactly which problem it is that you're trying to get at.
Yeah, that's great. That's a good place to wrap, because it's about the human, right? That we're trying to support. And then, so be brave, be human, and be willing to be in for the long haul. So that's, I think that's a good place to end. So I think we're almost exactly on time. So first, I'd like to thank Devin and Sarah joining today. I appreciate all of your insight, your knowledge, expertise. It's been fun. I'd like to thank my third guest, Hamilton, my dog, who joined as well. He's super interested in everything going on in this space. So if we didn't get to any of your questions, folks out there, feel free to reach out to me, or, you know, I'm sure you can find Devin and Sarah on LinkedIn as well. I'm sure they'd both be happy to have a chat. But with that, we'll end for the morning and the evening, and appreciate everybody's attention and involvement. It was a lot of fun, Devin and Sarah. Look forward to speaking with you both again sometime soon. So thanks, everybody, and we will talk very soon. Thanks.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you.